Welcome back. New research from the Southern Africa Labour and Development Research Unit suggests that the President Employment Stimulus Programme has had an effect on our economy. Under the scheme, people who had graduated from high school were able to work as classroom assistants or in some cases in the education system more generally. The idea was to try and grow the economy by stimulating demand and, of course, help people get sustainable income. Joshua Budlender is a research fellow at the Southern Africa Labour and Development Research Unit. They carried out this research. Joshua, good afternoon to you. It's been a big scheme, this employment scheme. You've been studying its impact. What did you find?
Afternoon, Stephen. So before I begin, let me just say in the interest of transparency that this research was funded by the French Development Agency with the support of the European Union, and it was commissioned by the presidency. But, you know, they commissioned independent academic research. At Seldry, that's what we do. So this is an independent research project. But the story is quite positive. So, yes, as you say, it's a very, very big program. It's part of the Presidential Employment Stimulus, which has received 42 billion rand since it started in 2020 and has created over 1.8 million jobs or livelihood opportunities, which are mainly kind of temporary jobs. And what we were looking at was something called the Basic Education Employment Initiative, which is the biggest part of it, which, as you say, is about employing teaching assistants. And really what we were looking at is whether there are these kind of spillover effects in the rest of the economy. Because while the main point of these programs is to give direct employment to young people and also to provide, you know, teaching assistance in schools, and there is research that does help students, given, you know, low economic growth in South Africa and budget constraints, we would like to see some kind of private sector job creation from these programs. And the way we do that is we look at the spending of people in these programs and we see what kind of sectors do they spend in. So, for example, if somebody buys bread because they're employed in the program and the program encourages them buying bread, does that then mean that somebody has to produce that bread? And maybe that's a bakery and they employ people. The bakery has raw products, you know, it has flour which has to be milled and grained. It's some kind of a business. And maybe if that wheat is produced in South Africa, that also helps the agricultural sector. So what we did is we basically looked at the spending patterns of these participants before and after the program and compared them to some other people. And then we looked at what sectors they bought goods in, what kinds of goods they bought. And we basically come to the conclusion that the program does stimulate economic activity, probably on the order of around 50 million rand per month is value added in the rest of the economy outside the program. And around 19 million rand a month is probably kind of wages unemployment. So this is over and above the direct kind of effect of the program on young people's employment and better teaching in schools.
So in other words, there's a sort of, I think one of the official phrases, you'll have to help me here, is a sort of multiplier effect. By giving these people jobs, these people had jobs and other jobs were created.
Exactly. And the multiplier effect is exactly what that's called, but it's not something that is obvious or will always happen because it depends what kinds of goods people buy. So, if people buy goods which are predominantly imported or which have low labor intensity, so they're mainly produced by machines and those industries don't really employ a lot of people, then we would expect quite a low multiplier because, more spending in that sector doesn't encourage more jobs. And what our study did is it took those kinds of things into account by using something called these input-output tables by Stats.SA, which tells you where different goods are produced in the economy, how much is imported, etc. And we took these spending effects and we kind of put them through the economy and saw kind of how many jobs were created. I should just note that there are other reasons. Our analysis is approximate. We can't actually follow each rand as it goes through the economy, so we can't look at things like potential price increases and stuff like that. But we think it's a pretty good estimate as to how many jobs or how much employment and the wage increase, how much income support is created outside of the direct sector.
There's another aspect to this, which is that if you give more money to poorer people, so in this case these people, I'm presuming, didn't have an income, they just left school, they're going to spend it on things that are probably made here. They're probably going to spend it on more and better food, which is important. They might well spend it on clothes. If you give that money to richer people, and this is an argument against inequality, Joshua, in doing the research that you do, you might well use this in some argument. If you give it to richer people, they're probably going to buy imported goods. So this is one of those sort of moments where it's quite important where the money goes, and in this case it went to the right place.
Right. I mean, one of the other things to think about is what people do with their money and how it supports the economy. So, for example, richer people tend to save more of their money compared to poorer people. Poorer people, because they don't have a lot of money, don't tend to save that much, and so they spend that money. And that obviously has, good and bad effects for the individual. Savings are good to have, but in the economy, it often is very good to spend money because that encourages economic activity, whereas savings have a kind of ambiguous effect. On the one hand, they may help provide financing if you want to do stuff like infrastructure, but on the other hand, when the money is sitting in a bank account and might not be productively used, that can not contribute to economic growth in the same way. So that is exactly one of the things to take into account, that there's a redistribution aspect here as well.
So Joshua, knowing what you know now, what your research found, this was probably a good investment by our country. We had to pay money. In other words, we paid these people's salaries. The government decided to pay the salaries of these young people, and that was actually a good investment for the whole country in the end.
I think it was, but I think that our research does support that conclusion. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the main benefit of the program is that, for just the Basic Education Employment Initiative has meant that 850,000 young people have got some kind of formal sector job experience, which they wouldn't have otherwise had. And that can be important for those people, not just because they get that money while they're actually employed. They get paid the national minimum wage, they get employed full-time for 5 months or 10 months, depends how long it is. But they also get job experience. And so we see in our study, when we follow these people, we can't follow the individuals, but we can follow their spending, that not only is their spending increased during the program, but also, to a less degree, but still, their spending remains increased above baseline levels even after the program ends. That may be because they have some saving, but it may also be because these people have now got skills and have experience which has helped them find private sector jobs after the program has ended, which is one of its objectives. Well,
I was going to come to this. There are actually all sorts of habits you get from working. You get up at the right time, you set an alarm, you go to bed early, things like that. Is there proper research on what happened to these people once their time in this employment ended, whether it did change their lives over the longer term?
We haven't got very detailed research about that yet. So there is an organization called Harambee Youth Employment Accelerator, and they have got details for a lot of these people, and they've been doing follow-up surveys to try and find out what happens, but that's kind of still in the works. The best we have right now is that we can see participants spending, and we can see how it does remain above baseline levels by about 4 or 5% afterwards. But I mean, in talking about long-run benefits, the other benefit, of course, is that these are teaching assistants and they help schools. So there's quite good research, not exactly of this program because it's still being rolled out, but of a very similar program, a randomized program that happened, I think, in 2021, which found that these kinds of teaching assistants do really help, especially in, I think, grade 1 to 3 with reading and numeracy scores.
Joshua, I'm sure you're aware of the arguments around a basic income grant, around whether or not social grants should have their value increased dramatically. There's an election year. I'm sure you know that too. And one of the arguments from people who believe there should be a basic income grant, and a basic income grant set at a level much higher than the sort of 350 Rand social relief of distress grant, is that it would create the multiplying effect that we've been talking about, that it would stimulate the economy. I'm sure you're aware your findings could be political dynamite in the right economic hands.
Right. I mean, so I think that our findings some people, when they argue for kind of like a basic income grant or something like that, basically suggest that the program would be self-financing for the reasons that you suggest, that there'd be such a large multiplier that, government would get back everything in tax revenue. That is, we can't go that far in terms of our conclusions, because you need a little bit more data to be able to do that. What you really need to be able to do then is see, for example, if that bread maker now gets a job, what do they spend things on? And we don't have that. We only have details on the participants' spending. So we can't really calculate an actual multiplying number which goes into that kind of deliberation. But we can see, yes, that there is that the kinds of goods that people buy, and we expect that social grant recipients to buy similar kinds of goods, that many of those goods are produced locally, many of those goods do have high labor intensity, and so that we do expect some of that value to come back into the South African economy. And, when you're talking about something like a basic income grant, there are a variety of costs and benefits, and we don't look really here at some of the costs, like, what are the costs of deficit financing or potentially higher taxes, etc. But when you're talking about the benefits, what we're saying is you need to consider these benefits as part of that. That is part of the benefit of the program.
And I mean, obviously, I imagine many young people, if you offered them a very small basic income grant and the opportunity to work and learn as they have in this process, this is a much better investment for the entire country than a basic income grant. But that's also a political argument, isn't it?
It is. I mean, as you say, I mean, it's a big discussion. Some people think that employment is better than a grant, because it gives people attach kind of meaning to work. They feel like it gives their lives some kind of decency. And then also, people get skills from work. And then also, these things provide direct services to people. It's not like these teaching assistants are just going and digging holes in the ground and filling them in again. They're actually, providing assistance to schools. And there is, as I said, research which suggests that it's effective. On the other hand, I think that one should keep in mind when talking about social grants that the scale of unemployment in the country is so massive that the public sector, like these kind of programs, would never be able to fill that gap. And until the private sector does fill that gap, you do need some kind of support for people who can't find work, which is not any fault of their own. When you've got unemployment on the order of 30% or 40%, the definition you're talking about, you can't blame the individual. There just aren't enough jobs. And there is obviously a historical reason for why there are so few jobs in South Africa.
Unemployment's been going up since the 1970s, apart from the sort of Mbeki era, hasn't it? Joshua Budlender, I really appreciate the time. We could go on for another 2 hours, by the way, but I'm being told that we can't. Joshua Budlender is a research fellow at the Southern Africa Labour and Development Research Unit. Where will the debate on the basic income grant end? Maybe coming soon.